The Simple Life of René Guénon by Paul Chacornac. Preface. We are about to speak of an extraordinary man, a man who was extraordinary in the strictest sense of the word, for we can neither define nor classify him. He was not an Orientalist, although, or perhaps because, no one knew the East better than he. He was not an historian of religions, although no one knew better than he how to illustrate their common basis, as well as the differences in their perspectives. He was not a sociologist, although no one has analyzed more profoundly the causes of the evils from which modern society is suffering, and from which it will doubtless perish unless it applies the remedies he propounded. He was not a poet, although one of his opponents admitted that his works acted like a spell and offered enough to satisfy even the most demanding imaginations. Neither was he an occultist, although he dealt with subjects long grouped under the denomination of occultism. Above all, he was not a philosopher, although he had taught philosophy and could demonstrate the inanity of its various systems whenever he came across them. We could say that he was a metaphysician, but the metaphysics he expounded has so little to do with manuals of philosophy that we fear we may give rise to serious misunderstanding by conferring this title upon him. Moreover, he himself said that none of the labels current in the Western world were appropriate to describe him. This man, extraordinary for his intelligence and knowledge, remained obscure throughout his life. He never occupied any official position. His works never enjoyed a large circulation, and were never published in the illustrious journals of his time. It has sometimes been said that he was surrounded by a conspiracy of silence. Perhaps. In any case, he did nothing to dissipate an obscurity that did not displease him. He quickly aroused the adherence and fervent admiration of certain people, in number never more than 1,000, who, tired of the mediocre nourishment offered by the modern world, impatiently awaited, month by month, his doctrinal clarifications and judgments on various currents of thought. And then, on the eve of the 9th of January, 1951, French radio broadcast news of the death of René Guénon, which had occurred 2 nights before. Articles on the personality and work of this man, who had scarcely known anything but anonymity, suddenly proliferated in the daily and weekly press, as well as in journals, and so we feel that this sudden focus on his work renders the present study necessary. Yet we feel almost driven to apologize for writing it, for a biography of René Guénon may with good reason surprise both his faithful readers and his closest personal friends. Indeed, René Guénon repeatedly said that personalities count for nothing in the traditional domain, the only domain of any importance in his view. We cannot, however, alter the fact that the modern world is more often interested in personalities than in their work, and if their life stories are not told, legends often arise that go far wide of the mark, and perhaps even contradict the facts. We believe, therefore, that we serve the truth, albeit in a modest way, by establishing or re-establishing the facts concerning René Guénon's life, and we intend to confine ourselves to these facts. In other words, to speak in fashionable jargon, no psychoanalysis of René Guénon will be found here. It is sometimes justifiable to explain a literary or even a philosophical work by reference to the author's temperament and character, but such an approach would be ridiculous in the case of work as non-individualistic as Guénon's, and in the presence of a man who refrained from any merely personal thought and never claimed any merit other than that of acting as an unobtrusive and conscientious spokesman for an immemorial tradition transcending all thought and sentiment. What is most extraordinary in Guénon is doubtless the almost total effacement of his individuality before the doctrine he formulates. We have gathered together a certain number of facts from printed texts, private correspondence, and the direct testimony of some who knew Guénon personally. Many facts have no doubt escaped our notice, and some, among them perhaps the most important, will no doubt always elude the historian. We have not tried to conceal the gaps. When we do not know, we say so, and when it seems permissible to formulate an hypothesis, we present it as such. In our work there are also some voluntary omissions, and it will be understood that this cannot be otherwise when one writes so close in time to the events in question. We could not involve third parties without their consent, and there are cases where we would not even think of asking for it. Above all, we could have said more than we do about the period extending from the beginning of 1929 to the end of 1950, notably about the hopes and disappointments Guénon experienced in connection with certain repercussions of his work. But this would not have pleased everyone concerned, and Guénon would certainly not have wished it.
Even in the domain of facts, we must remain silent about certain things, unless inopportune disclosures force us to do otherwise. We must now raise a personal matter. We apologize for it, but do not see how it can be avoided. Some may not have forgotten that in 1926 we published a book entitled Eliphas Lévy, Rénovateur de l'occultisme, and it might seem strange that we now undertake a biography of René Guénon, who once planned to write an Erreur occultiste to complement his critical works Theosophy, History of a Pseudo-Religion, and The Spiritist Fallacy. We are not embarrassed to admit that, although we continue to find Eliphas Lévy captivating, we would not write our book again in the same way today. If God grant us life, we shall publish a new edition with the necessary corrections. Why should this be surprising? What is the use of living and growing old if one learns nothing? We believe that we have learned something in the past third of a century, and thanks to Guénon have carefully revised many of our own views. It seems to us, however, that Guénon's admirers, particularly among the young, are sometimes too harsh on all that preceded him. They forget too readily how difficult it was in the modern West, prior to Guénon, to acquire precise notions on esoterism, initiation, and the traditional sciences, and how much effort was required of those in the mid-19th century who had a presentiment of something beyond exoterism, and how much anxiety they must have felt. In her article, Les idées traditionnelles au temps des grandes illusions, Madame Marie-Paul Bernard appropriately recalls, with the publication in 1861 of Eliphas Lévy's Transcendental Magic, Its Doctrine and Ritual, the notion of the fundamental unity of the different traditions, under the designation occult philosophy, was affirmed. At the same time, the concept of esoterism appeared under its twofold aspect of sacerdotal and royal initiation. Through the veil of all the hieratic and mysterious allegories of ancient dogmas, through the darkness and bizarre ordeals of all the ancient initiations, under the seal of all the sacred scriptures, in the ruins of Nineveh and of Thebes, under the crumbling stones of the ancient temples, and on the blackened face of the sphinxes of Assyria or Egypt, in the monstrous or marvelous paintings that express the sacred pages of the Vedas for the believers of India, in the strange symbols of our old books on alchemy, in the admission ceremonies practiced by all mysterious societies, one rediscovers the traces of a doctrine everywhere the same, and everywhere carefully veiled. Occult philosophy appears to have been the nourisher or the godmother of all the religions, the secret lever of all the intellectual forces, the key to all the divine obscurities, and the absolute queen of all ages when she was exclusively reserved for the education of priests and kings. Eliphas Lévy has without doubt barely glimpsed the metaphysical aspect of the esoteric tradition that he describes, following Cornelius Agrippa as occult philosophy. He probably attached too much importance to certain secondary traditional sciences, but this passage retains its beauty and meaning nonetheless. In a footnote, Madame Bernard adds, for those readers who might wonder why Eliphas Lévy is quoted, what René Guénon wrote of him. Eliphas Lévy would no doubt be the first to disavow his would-be successors, to whom he was certainly very much superior intellectually, while nonetheless at the same time far from being as profound as he wished to appear, and he was mistaken in viewing everything through the mentality of an 1848 revolutionary. If we have spent some time discussing his opinions, it is because we know how great his influence has been, even upon those who scarcely understood him, and we think it best to fix the limits within which his competence can be acknowledged. Guénon thus made it quite clear that he did not hold Eliphas Lévy fully responsible for the occult movement that was born toward the end of the 19th century, and also that he recognized in him a certain competence that must no doubt be linked to the intermediate world. In our conclusion, we shall attempt to delineate to what extent Guénon was the continuator of a current of thought little known in the 19th century, and to what extent his contribution was truly new for the modern West. We shall see that his role was great and noble enough that, while according him our unreserved admiration, we need not disregard entirely the merits of other sincere researchers, perhaps less endowed and, in any case, less fortunate than he.